Hello class, this is your lecture on flowers and fruits. The outline is as follows. We'll do a quick review of dicots versus monocots, and then we'll dive into all of the various structures that we find in flowers. That is to say, what is the morphology and anatomy of these very important reproductive organs of the flowering plants. Once the female part of a flower gets fertilized, it usually forms into a fruit, and we're going to learn a short list of fleshy versus dry types of fruits. First, what is this comparison of dicots versus monocots? On the left-hand side of your screen, we see a type of California native plant called thimbleberry, and it often grows under the redwoods next to streams and other wet areas. And it produces a fruit that looks kind of like a raspberry, you might say, but we're going to learn later on in this lecture exactly what type of fruit this is. Now, to review the dicots, they have two cotyledons, their flower parts are in 4s or 5s, and their leaves are net-like with their venation. The monocots, on the other hand, an example being the banana plant, and here we can see a cross-section view through the banana fruit. Again, by the end of this lecture, we'll know what type of a fruit a banana is classified as. Monocots have one cotyledon, flower parts in parts of 3, and leaves with parallel primary veins. A flower is simply a modified stem tip with highly compressed internodes, bearing structures that are highly modified leaves. Each flower, which begins as an embryonic primordium that develops into a bud, occurs as a specialized branch at the tip of a peduncle, which may be divided, or rather subdivided, into smaller units called pedicels. And these pedicel tips might swell up into a receptacle, which would be the small pad to which all of the flower parts are attached. Now, if a flower possesses all 4 of the whorls, we refer to it as a complete flower. In addition, we're going to learn terms such as perfect versus imperfect flowers, but we're going to reserve that for later in the semester. Right now, we need to know that complete flowers means that the flower has all 4 whorls present. And like I mentioned previously, the swollen tip of the pedicel is the receptacle, and that receptacle is where all of the whorls are ultimately attached. Whorl number 1 is the sepals. Collectively, all of the sepals are referred to as the calyx. The sepals primarily protect the flower when it's in bud, and the sepals may be green or not. In fact, there's many examples where sepals look like petals. Whorl number 2 is the petals, and collectively all of the petals form what is called a corolla. Now, petals may be showy, reduced, or absent, and if we combine the calyx plus the corolla, that equals the perianth. And sometimes when we're talking about flowers, it's useful to refer to the perianth as a single unit. Whorl number 3 is the stamens, and the fancy word for this unit is the andrecium. Let's look at these root words. Andro means male, and ecium means house of. So it's essentially the house of male parts, and this is where the sperm cells will ultimately be produced. Now, just like the sepals and petals are highly modified leaves, so are the stamens, but it's more difficult to imagine this as a highly modified leaf because it doesn't look flat or blade-like at all. However, the stamens are composed of an anther sac on the end of a filament, and that anther is the site of gamete production, and in males, the gametes are sperm cells. Those sperm cells are carried in units called pollen grains. Whorl number 4 is the carpels, and another word for carpels is pistils, but carpels is usually the preferred term, and in this course we're going to use the word carpels exclusively. The name for the unit that describes all of the female parts is the gynoecium. Those root words, gyno means female, and again, ecium means house of, so this is the house of female parts. The carpel is composed of 3 different structures. And again, carpels are simply the result of highly modified leaves. The 3 parts of a carpel include the stigma, which receives the pollen, the style, which holds up the stigma, and the ovary, which contains the ovules. The ovary develops into a fruit, and the ovules, after they get fertilized, will develop into the seeds. Now, in this diagram of a flower, we can see that it is a single carpel represented. Therefore, we refer to it as monocarpous. Now, at the same time, we could refer to this as a single pistil. And we're going to make a distinguishing characteristic of pistils versus carpels in just a moment. Now, while we learn parts of flowers, there are often mutations. So, for example, we know that monocots always are in parts of 3s, and yet here is a mutant monocot. It's actually a native lily from California that grows around the CSM campus, and in this case, you can look, there's an extra petal and an extra stamen. So while we learn the parts of a flower, it can be really challenging to actually apply that in the real world to the flowers of our planet. Remember, there are tens or even hundreds of thousands of different types of species of plants. So here's an example of where we get chocolate from. It's Theobroma cacao. And it's all about position to figure out what is a stamen, what is a petal, what is the carpel. It can be very, very challenging to figure all of this out. Here's a fun fact. The world's largest single flower is called Rafflesia arnoldii, and it grows in Southeast Asian forests. It's classified as monoecious, and that's spelled Monoecious. And if we look at these root words, mono means one, and the ecious means house. So it's another form of this word for house. So that means it's one single structure or flower that has male parts and female parts separate from each other. And that can be challenging to identify when you're looking at these organisms in the field. Flowers occur on flowering stems that are called inflorescence types. And these inflorescences can be broken down into many different categories. This is just a few of them. A spadix is common for members of the Araceae. That includes things like the Titan arum, philodendron. They often produce these swollen flowering stems that produce lots of little flowers. A spike and a raceme are very similar. It's all about if there is a pedicel or not. The catkin is a hanging inflorescence, often used in wind pollination. And the umbel is unique because all of those pedicels are subdivided from one single point, and these umbels are very common in members of the carrot family. Here's another fun fact. The world's largest branched inflorescence is from the talipot fan palm from southern India. The fan palm, with its large palmate leaves that grow up to 16 feet in diameter and a petiole up to 13 feet long, can have even bigger inflorescence. The inflorescence of these palm trees are 20 to 30 feet long. So it's pretty phenomenal how tall this gets. On this inflorescence will be several million small flowers. Of course, it takes a really long time to produce this. It takes these palms 30 to 80 years to save up enough energy in order to produce this inflorescence. And after it flowers and hopefully produces fruits and seeds, the palm tree dies. And the world's largest unbranched inflorescence, this is the Titan arum. And here we can see this person's very happy that they found it. They're not that easy to find out in the forests of Southeast Asia, including India, and they smell really bad. They're also called the corpse flower because they emit the scent of rotten flesh to attract flies who fly in thinking it's a dead body. Now, in some species, particularly the genus Anthurium, we find an inflorescent structure called spathe and spadix. The spathe is the large bract. It's a floral bract, which is something that we've learned about in our previous lectures. And the spadix is an inflorescence that might have tens or even hundreds of tiny flowers along it. Orchids also have weird language to describe their flowers. They're monocots in parts of threes, but one of their petals is called the labellum, and it's highly modified into a landing platform for very specific pollinators. So, sexual reproduction in the flowering plants depends exclusively on pollination. So we have to move the pollen from one genetic individual to another. There are instances where flowers can self-pollinate, but then we're not getting any genetic diversity, and we need genetic diversity for the longevity of any population. Recall that the carpel contains an ovary that contains the ovules, and these ovules are essentially the eggs. And once the sperm reaches the egg, that is when we have fertilization. Now, when the sperm cells land on the stigma, that is simply referred to as pollination. Only if the conditions are correct will a pollen grain that contains the sperm be able to germinate on the stigma and actually fertilize our ovule. This slide shows us a few of the interesting pollinators that we see on our planet, and I'm going to tell some stories about these. So first, we've got bees. Bees are very common pollinators. Most people think about bees when they think about something on a flower. However, there are many other animals, particularly flies, that actually are more common than bees in most parts of the world. A bee-pollinated flower has very unique characteristics. They're usually colorful because bees can see in color, and they also produce nice aromas and lots of nectar because the bees can smell and they want to come in and they want to drink that nectar, and then of course they get the pollen on their bodies. Now, beetle-pollinated flowers are less sophisticated. They're usually just big open landing pads with lots of parts. Beetles aren't very sophisticated flyers, so they'll just kind of hunker on down to these flowers and then basically eat the pollen. But because these flowers produce so much pollen, a lot of it gets stuck to the beetle's body. We talked about the Titan arum and Rafflesia. Both of those are pollinated by flies, and that's because they don't smell very good. So they're going to attract flies who think that the flower is actually rotting meat. Now, in some cases, small mammals, such as this shrew, will pollinate flowers. This pen-tailed shrew is an interesting story because it pollinates a type of palm tree that grows in Malaysia. And even though we call it a shrew, it's actually a small type of primate. And this little thing will go to these palms and it'll drink its nectar. But the weird thing about it is this nectar is actually fermented. The nectar has the alcohol equivalent of about a 3.8% beer. So that's kind of strange. This little guy drinks beer all night long and never gets drunk. It's able to metabolize this alcohol because, as you can imagine, if you were drinking booze and you were a little mammal in a tree, you would get eaten right away if you couldn't run away from your predators. So kind of a funny story. And then the last one is this insect mimic. This picture in the center of the screen, it looks like an insect, but it's actually an orchid flower that perfectly looks like a female bee. So the male bees come along and they are trying to reproduce with the female, and they don't realize that it is actually just a flower. So the orchid is able to trick these bees into visiting. Now, many flowers are bird-pollinated, and the characteristics of bird-pollinated flowers is they typically are large, showy, produce lots and lots of nectar, and have little to no fragrance because birds can't smell. There's no reason to waste your energy producing aromatic compounds if the bird can't smell it anyways. Wind pollination is very common in many different ecological systems. Things like grasses, which are monocots, are wind pollinated, and also trees that produce catkins. For example, willow, which belongs to the genus Salix. All right, so after our flowers get fertilized, that is to say the sperm reaches the egg and seeds form, the ovary swells up around that seed to form the fruit. Fruits are therefore an ovary and its accessory parts that have developed and matured. Typically, fruits contain seeds, but not always. And all fruits develop from flower ovaries and accordingly are found exclusively in the flowering plants. Now, remember earlier we talked about the chocolate plant. Theobroma cacao is the scientific name. It has really weird flowers, and it also has really weird fruits. It actually doesn't follow any of the rules of fruit classification, which is kind of interesting. So while we learn the generalizations, there are always deviants out there that don't follow the botanical rules. We just kind of have to fit it in based upon its characteristics. So when we look at a fruit, we can break it down into regions, and these are tissue regions. The exocarp is the skin, the endocarp is the inner boundary around the seed, and the mesocarp, remember meso means middle, is the fleshy tissue between the exocarp and the endocarp. And these three regions are collectively referred to as the pericarp. Now, let's do a short list of the different types of fruits that we need to learn for our exam. The first big group of fruits is the fleshy fruits. And we're going to break down the fleshy fruits into simple fleshy fruits that develop from a flower with one single carpel. And we're going to learn three types of these simple fleshy fruits right now. The first is a drupe. It's a simple fleshy fruit with a single seed enclosed by a hard, stony endocarp. So for these, things like cherries and peaches with that big seed in the middle, well, that is a drupe. Number two is a berry. A berry usually develops from a compound ovary and often contains more than one seed. And we need to further break down berry into three types. First, a true berry. This is a fruit with a thin skin and a relatively soft pericarp. For example, things like tomatoes are true berries. Number two is a peepo. Peepos have relatively thick rinds. Things like melons and pumpkins are classified as peepos, which are types of berries. And lastly, hesperidium. These are berries that are covered with leathery skin containing oils. And these essential oils are citrus oils. So things like oranges, lemons, limes, grapefruits, all are classified as a hesperidium, which again is a type of berry. And third is a pome for our simple fleshy fruit. The bulk of the flesh of our pome actually isn't from the ovary at all. Most of what you eat when you're eating an apple comes from the enlarged floral tube or receptacle that grows up around the ovary. An example is, as I just mentioned, the apple. So what about the not so simple fleshy fruits? First, the aggregate fruits. These are derived from a single flower with several to many carpels. These individual carpels mature as a clustered unit on a single receptacle. So examples include raspberries and strawberries and blackberries. So a blackberry and a raspberry is simply an aggregate of druplets, and a strawberry is an aggregate of achenes. Later on in this lecture, we're going to learn that an achene is the same thing as a sunflower seed, which is very strange. So when we look at a strawberry, when we eat a strawberry, we're not really eating a ovary. We're eating a swollen receptacle, and the fruits of the strawberry are the little dots on it. Pretty cool. So next up is multiple fruits. These are derived from several to many individual flowers in a single inflorescence. So examples of this includes things like figs and pineapples. Next up, the dry fruits. So the first group of dry fruits is those that split at maturity. And the fancy word for splitting at maturity is dehiscent. That is to say, these fruits dehisce when they mature. The first type of dehiscent fruit is a follicle. It splits along one side or seam. The next is a legume. This splits along two sides or seams. Next up is a silique. This splits along two sides or seams, but the seeds are borne on a central partition, exposed when the two halves separate. And the last one is a capsule, and this is basically everything else. If it's not one of the first three types of dehiscent fruits, then most likely it's a capsule. Here's a really cool capsule. This looks like a Photoshop job, but these are actual snapdragon flower capsules, and they look like little skulls just hanging off of the inflorescence. Now, some dry fruits don't split open at maturity, and these are referred to as indehiscent fruits. The first example is a nut. Acorns from the oak tree are classified as nuts. It's a hard, stony pericarp around a large central seed. Another type of indehiscent fruit is a samara, and these look like little helicopters. They spin down to the ground away from the parent plant. We see samaras in most species of maple trees. And lastly, the achene. So achenes are indehiscent fruits that you might call it a sunflower seed when you eat it, but in reality it's a fruit, and the seed is inside. The single seed is embedded in a hard pericarp, and these achenes are very common in most of the species of the sunflower family. And another fun fact, the world's brightest and shiniest fruit is this, the African marbleberry. It looks like science fiction, right? Stranger than life. It's a monocot from the forests, and it actually has a dry, globular fruit. Now, while it looks like it's this metallic, iridescent fruit, it's not from pigment. Instead, the coloration is structural color. That is to say, ultraviolet light vibrates around between these tiny coiled cellulose strands that it makes it appear as if it's metallic. And this attracts birds. Birds are always attracted to sparkly objects, and so this tricks them into eating something that's actually rock hard and not a nice juicy fruit. Pretty cool. Alright, so in review, we've now learned a comparison of the dicots versus the monocots. We've learned about the structure of the flowers, and we've learned about a short list of fruits. And remember from that first overview slide, we talked about the thimbleberry and the banana. See if you can figure out which type of fruits these are based upon what we've just learned. And if you can't figure it out, send me an email and we can talk about it. All right, that's it for today's lecture. Thank you very much for listening.